Welcome everybody, and welcome back if you're new to your Cult Situation Report. I am Daniela, scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership, and the author of a book called Uncultured, about growing up in the Children of God religious cult, and then going into the U.S. Army cult. And while I was watching a cult leader run America, I decided I had something to say about it. Also during COVID, I went back to school and got a master's degree in organizational psychology from Harvard, and now I am working on writing a book called The Culting of America. I really call myself the disorganizational psychologist because I don't actually care about the groups. I don't know or believe that groups want to be better, but I just care about helping individuals understand groups that have hurt them in the past, groups that are hurting them now, and groups that could hurt them in the future. I do this once a week because in the Army, every officer is sending up a situation report every week of kind of everything that went on in their little world that their unit has purview over. And so I decided, let's do that about cults. So here we go. This week, as ever, we've been talking a lot about the cult of white supremacy on my social media, so my TikTok and my Instagram, as well as in recording the podcast, Hey White Woman, which is a podcast that I do with a Black creator who calls herself the White Woman Whisperer, and we are deconstructing white supremacy like the cult that it is. This is something that has been on my personal journey of deconstructing the cult of white supremacy and becoming anti-racist. But just like any cult, the only thing that you have to do to leave the cult isn't just leave. That's just the first stage of deconstruction, right? Physically, mentally leaving after you have the crack in the brainwashing. Then comes the decade of deconstruction, phase 2, which starts when you start it, of understanding why you were in this cult and all of these impacts that it has had on you and your personality. And that takes a lot of work. I feel like I'm getting to the end of mine, which is very nice, because the third phase is moving forward with no models, right? Going forward and intentionally living your life with only the things you want in it, not the things that you got from this toxic system that you had to recover from. So anyways, one thing that we were talking about this week was just like the entire system of white supremacy and how it's not as simple as just saying, I am not racist, right? This is kind of the same thing for me when we look at cults. You start deconstructing and you see that white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy are these cult systems that we are all under. But like, you can't just opt out of capitalism. You can't just opt out of patriarchy because these are still systems that run, well, kind of the whole world, definitely our country. Same thing with white supremacy, right? As we participate in this system, we are upholding it, but it's not that simple as to just be like, I'm not a racist, because everything that we do is connected to this system. So really behooves us to figure that out. One of the parts of the conversation this week was about white vegetarianism and white veganism and how that came into the United States in the 18th century through Dr. John Kellogg. Yes, that Kellogg. The same Kellogg that invented graham crackers and crunchy cereal so that children would not have lustful thoughts. Yeah, that man was a piece of work. Anyway, if you are a white person in America and you are a vegetarian or a vegan and you have not kind of investigated where that comes from, this was before the time of caring for animals, and this was before the time of the concept that abstaining from meat would be better for your health. So it really did come in through this eugenicist way of thinking, through the Seventh-day Adventist cult, which Seventh-day Adventist, in knowing our cult families, also leads to Jehovah's Witnesses that are very much a cult, and the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. And Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas leads to the Oklahoma City bombing in retaliation for Waco, Texas, and also because that man was a terrorist. Anyway, this is one of those things where people will respond, well, no, not me. I just do it because of animals. Like, yeah, but you don't prepare everything in that process. In order to eat vegetarian or vegan, you are participating in an entire system that contributes to that is mostly run by white people in America. And I also just think it's interesting when people like push back really hard on this stuff. Like they'll be like, oh, not me, not at all. Like, okay, cool. Then I'm sure you're the person that should want to go investigate this to make sure that you're not building things in by accident. A great place to start, by the way, is the book Fearing the Black Body by Dr. Sabrina Strings. And the very next thing is talking about Jehovah's Witnesses being a cult. Like, the results are in. Almost every cult expert out there considers them a cult. They are on the cult documentaries. There's a good episode about them on, it's a show called Cults and Extreme Beliefs, or A&E's Cults and Extreme Beliefs. I believe they are the 3rd episode. You see all of the same stuff with Jehovah's Witnesses, right? The charismatic leadership, I'll come back to that. The labor, right? Labor of women and children, especially the child sexual abuse and other kinds of abuses that go on. Jehovah's Witnesses are incredibly bad at this. I think most cults eventually get there, though, to the abuse of the children, because cults are about power, as is sexual assault. And if you are powerful enough to assault the children and walk away fine, you are very powerful. And this is why I think we always see it getting to that in these cults. And by the way, Children of God, the cult that I grew up in, was known to be the religious prostitution and pedophilia for God part cult. So, yeah, familiar. The Children of God, however, was very upfront about their sexuality and nudity and weirdness and all of this. Most cults I see go the opposite way, into purity. Just like to remind everybody that purity culture and pedophilia culture are the same things. It's all about the obsession with the sexuality of children, and it's all bad. With Jehovah's Witnesses, right? People always like to do this gotcha one, stop you right at the beginning, and they think it's going to work, saying that, well, Jehovah's Witnesses can't be a cult because we don't have a single leader. Well, first of all, we almost never see groups without leaders. Almost never. But we did see one pretty significant one, which was QAnon. So the first thing I'm going to say is that what scholars are debating the most right now about cults is whether they need to have a very specific leadership figure. But also, there's a term for when it is a council of elders, and this is called charisma by proxy. And we'll get more into all of this charisma stuff. But I just always like to say, when people are like using this like, haha, loophole, we're not a cult because like, when you need a loophole to get you out of your definition of being a cult, like, you're a cult. And I know this because I started having people use this loophole against me with the Jehovah's Witnesses, who I knew was a cult because I can recognize them. And I reached out to Dr. Yanya Lalich and I said, what do we say about this, about the elder thing? And she said, oh, it's called charisma by proxy. So going into first, why it can be a council of leaders and the whole concept of the charismatic leader. I've actually changed my 10 points to say charismatic leadership, and I'll get into why that's important. But talking about the council, right? It used to be, when we thought it had to be a single charismatic leader, we didn't understand as much about humans and especially our rationality or lack of it back then, right? I think, therefore I am, Rene Descartes, right? Like, this is proven to be empirically not so true. Human beings make most of their decisions based on recency bias, what has worked for you most recently, and social proof, what everybody else is doing. And so, because we now know this, and we also understand that in a closed system, a group of elders can go just as awry, maybe even egging each other on with that social proof there, as can one single leader, right? So a group of leaders can operate as one leader. This also goes for AA, where their leadership hierarchy is time sober. Okay, and then on top of that, it's never a bad time to get into the details of charismatic authority and charismatic leadership, which is different from being charismatic. And both of these terms are used and often mistaken for each other, right? So there's two types of authority. There's authority through force or power, right? You're physically bigger, parents and small children, men and over women sometimes. Or you have the bigger, stronger army, right? America, rest of the world. Authority through power. Or you have authority through charisma, charismatic authority. And charismatic authority was coined by a sociologist named Max Weber, who wanted us to understand leadership through consent, basically. And he secularized this concept from religious concept, where the preacher or the pastor or the pope has authority over people who let them have authority over them, so by choice, because of some qualities they believe they have. And Max Weber thinks that charismatic authority is so important to humans because we've lost the concept of magic in the world because of too many scientific advancements. And sometimes we've even lost the concept of religion. So charismatic authority simply means you've agreed to let this person have authority over you in some way, shape, or form, right? So with the parent thing, right, the difference of when your 3-year-old doesn't want to do something and you can just pick them up and move them, and when your 15-year-old doesn't want to do something and you have to convince them, right? You've now become a charismatic authority in their life, no longer a physical authority or a authority by force. So when it comes to charismatic leadership, this means any leader that we have given authority over us. So if you are in a head of the household, umbrella culture kind of thing, every man is a charismatic leader in that household. Pastors and preachers, politicians. I kind of think money should count in the by force category. So like your boss and your job, not necessarily under charismatic leadership. But we do know a lot of times it can go both ways, right? With charismatic leadership, you also have the deification of idiosyncrasy, which is our human ability to make excuses for the inexcusable behavior of our charismatic leaders. This is Donald Trump, and this is my third rule of cults. So first rule of cults is the epigraph of uncultured, which is the first rule of cults is you're never in a cult. Second rule of cults I put into words watching the Harry-Meghan saga, which is the cult will forgive any sin, Prince Andrew, except for the sin of leaving. And the third rule of cults is the deification of idiosyncrasy and Donald Trump, which is even if he did it, doesn't mean he's guilty. Okay, so that is charismatic leadership. Now, being charismatic or having charisma, those have evolved to mean different things. They're still around the concept of you have these qualities, some that we can describe and some that are really ineffable, but much like the Supreme Court definition of pornography, you can't describe it, but you know it when you see it. We know when people are charismatic. And one thing is that researchers apparently say that you cannot perform charisma. It's just something you have or not. I tend to disagree because I believe that after growing up at the feet of cult leaders, I can indeed perform charisma. I call it turning myself on. Could also just be the autistic mask. Anyway, so being charismatic, which we can kind of sum up as charming. There are a couple of other things. Tallness is something that makes people consider someone to be charismatic. I think that's because literally larger than life. Although there's a limit, which I think for women is 6 feet and for men is 6'4", over which now you're uncanny valley. Now you're too tall, and so it's frightening. But there's definitely a tallness bias. In fact, when people meet me, often they're like, I thought you were taller because I am 5'5". But apparently I have tall energy. That's the charisma. But it can be really important to understand this difference when you're trying to understand cults, especially cults like the cult of MAGA, and we'll get to that at the end of this show. But like, he's not charming. And very often, cult leaders are not. In fact, they're often kind of bumbling idiots. But it is still something about them, because of some qualities about them, whether they claim to be the prophet of God, like David Berg, whether they claim to be the smartest man on earth, like Keith Raniere, right? They convince people to put authority, to give them authority over them. And that is really what cults are. People have given away their right to make choices to this leader because they have been convinced that this leader is the answer for some existential questions they are trying to solve, and that their mission is the most important thing in the world. And this weaponization of the mission I call missionizing. I have, chapters about all of these. I'm working on chapter 7 right now, which is step 5, isolation, chapter 6. Isolation Nation, about how isolation is used in cults. In the book that I'm writing, The Culting of America, I am trying to somewhat show people that the term cult doesn't really matter at all. So let's dig into the components, like of group behavior, that make up a cult. But then I'm also going to show you how we see that not only in the real cults, but the military and then groups around us. Because by figuring out the tactics of cults and extreme groups and bad leaders is how we protect ourselves from them in the future. Because as we know from BoJack the horse, I think, when we look at someone through rose-colored glasses, red flags just look like flags. We talked a bit about the Amish and the Mennonites this week. I said, yes, they're total cults. There is a difference. There are assimilated Mennonites that are kind of similar to all your other churches. And then there are the plain Mennonites, or the plain people, and they are the ones that live completely separated from society. Now, there are a couple things here that always concern me. First of all, I think if you're raising children, holding them separate from society, you are harming them. They are going to be othered for the rest of their lives. This is kind of why the Rumspringa thing that the Amish do is so pointless. Like, it's just such a cult thing to be like, see, we let them go free. Yeah, but do you know how painful your first months and years out of a cult are when you've never been subjected to the wider world? Like, it's not fun. It's not just like fun party time. Go do whatever you want. You don't fit. Of course, most of them are going to want to go back. I spent 6 years wanting to go back until I found the army to get me to the next stage that I needed to be. But that doesn't mean it wasn't horrible. Anyways, one of the problems, I think, with the Amish and a lot of these Anabaptist religions in general is this whole nostalgia thing, right? Like, oh, it was a simpler time, buggies and carriages, and no labor laws. So women and children could just be worked pretty much as slaves, which is absolutely still what happens in these Amish communities. There is a book by my friend Mary Byler called Amish Misfit, and she really goes into just her memoir, but some of the horrific abuses that happen. And for the most part, as Americans, we just leave the Amish alone because religious freedom and turn our heads. And in my opinion, because we like their products, the butter and the popcorn and all the other crap. They're huge exploiters of labor, a lot in the construction businesses. I mean, there are whole parts of the country where all of the houses are built by the Amish, which is usually teen boys and child labor. Cults are always about labor. This is a very important thing to understand. I thought the movie Women Talking was pretty intense and interesting. I did recommend it on one of my videos. However, Mary Byler has another perspective where she says, it's still very unrealistic. Like, it's supposed to be a not real story, but just the concept that these women could even sit around debating, fighting back against the menfolk that are abusing them is just not really realistic. And that a lot of the stuff that we see, even about exposing the Amish, is still very just created for the amusement of external America, and is not really changing a lot of what is going on. So yeah, And then on my channels, especially TikTok, as I like to really moderate and be involved in the conversation, and because I've recently talked about, like, look, Mormons are a cult, Jehovah's Witnesses are cults, the Amish communities are cults. Like, we need to start looking at these things. So now people want to ask me to diagnose all of these different groups. And for the most part, I don't do that. I like to say that I am not the deity that names cults. The only people that gets to name cults are the media, and it's usually only done when we can measure the damage in bodies. And so this is why I spend my whole life trying to put it into words, right? Or as we say in the military, like going to the left of the boom so that you can help people see the indicators of danger before it gets them. So I'm just not like an expert in all of these individual cults. It reminds me of when I had a lieutenant who was a major in geography, and everyone used to be like, oh, can you list every country in the world? And, the answer was no. Most people can't even list all 50 states without missing some. But that's not the point, right? The point is all of this other information that you know. So I take my extreme story, growing up in the one that everyone agrees is a cult, and all of my education and knowledge in this area and the parallels that I can make to these other kinds of groups to be like, look at this behavior. This behavior in and of itself can be problematic. For example, I had this week the question that, like, well, all disciplines have their own language, right? Like every kind of job vertical that you're in, or different companies will have their own words for things. Like, okay, let's break that down a little bit. So I think for it to be considered like its own distinguishable vernacular, it's like if I were to drop you into an operations meeting or brief or like planning session of that organization and you couldn't understand what was going on without a translator, then that's a distinguishable vernacular. This is where I would put the military, NASA, hospitals. I was just reading Kamala Harris's wonderful biography, and she talks about how in hospitals, like she compares it to being in the legal field, right? Like when you are in court, you have the right to an attorney because they understand that there's so much distinguished vernacular and internal stuff that you have really kind of no shot against a trained lawyer. And she's making the case that the same thing should be true in hospitals. There should be patient advocates for every single person because, as she saw in the experience of trying to advocate for her mother who had breast cancer, and her mother who was a cancer researcher, or sorry, she has colon cancer, but her mother was a cancer researcher, and still the two of them had a hard time navigating the healthcare system and advocating for the patient because of that distinguished vernacular, right? So therein lies the second part of the problem, right? It's like, so not every company or organization or vertical has a distinguishable vernacular to the level that we're talking about. But those that do, that's still a cause for concern. That's still a place you should be aware of. There was an evacuation in 2006 of American citizens out of a country in the Middle East. And they had to very quickly take out 400,000 citizens. And this is when they learned that none of the branches of the Department of Defense could really speak to each other because we have such specialized language. And this was when, in addition to the coalition of forces fighting in the Forever War, we started putting a lot more emphasis on joint operations because we understood that we needed to be able to speak to each other and how disabling it is when you can't. And these are people that are in relatively similar jobs. This is a huge part of the issue that we have with veteran transition when veterans get out of the military, is that they have sometimes decades of job history that they don't know how to talk about in a way that makes it matter to a civilian hiring manager. And all of this to say that unlearning your distinguishable vernacular when you leave a cult is a big part of the deconstruction, and sometimes it's the last thing that people do. But you have to be able to translate your experience into, civilian language outside the cult. Systemite language, if you will. That's what we called our outsiders. So even if you just have this one point, that's still something you want to look at. That's still a threat to your organization. because one of the things distinguishable vernacular does is further isolates you, right? You're further isolated from the outside world, which also means fewer people can do said work, which means the people who can are going to have more of their labor exploited and be expected to sacrifice more. So you see how they're all tied together? I always tell people, like, this is my spectrum. You're either 10% or 100% a cult. But once you're 100%, I don't think there's any difference. I don't think there are better or worse cults. I think the only difference is time, money, and impunity. And humans will become as garbage as they are allowed to be, especially in these closed systems and total institutions. And yes, just for fun, isolation is the chapter that I'm writing about this month. So there's a lot of discussion about isolation and how that is used in domestic violence, single family cults, and regular cults, but also in the military, by corporations, right? I mean, there have been corporations like Zappos that have intentionally moved themselves into the deserts of Las Vegas to build an intentional community, but also to isolate you. So people are reliant on that community where they work for everything. Turned out to be a bit of a crazy experiment. And that is the example that I'm using to lead into the chapter about isolation. But it's really important to note that isolation has really, really changed with AI, right? I used to say that if you wanted to isolate an American citizen in the 60s and 70s, when my grandfather joined the Children of God cult, you pretty much had to take them off to your compound in Texas or Brazil, because all Americans were reading the same things and watching the same television shows, right? So even if you were on polar opposite sides of an issue, you still had a shared reality. And now this is completely changed, right? Like all of the different platforms, like there's all using algorithms. In fact, algorithmic radicalization is such an accepted thing now, it has its own Wikipedia page. And why? Of course, I'm going to read it to you. Algorithmic radicalization is the concept that recommender algorithms on popular social media sites such as YouTube and Facebook drive users toward progressively more extreme content over time, leading them to developing radicalized extremist political views. Algorithms record user interactions from likes/dislikes to amount of time spent on posts to generate endless media aimed to keep users engaged. Through the echo chamber channels, the consumer is driven to be more polarized through preferences in media and self-confirmation. Algorithmic radicalization remains a controversial phenomenon, as it is often not in the best interest of social media companies to remove echo chamber channels. To what extent recommender algorithms are actually responsible for radicalization remains controversial. Studies have found contradictory results as to whether algorithms have promoted extremist content. But we also know that the channel, from meme to extreme, as I call it, is quite an established one. And that what they're trying to do is get you to spend more on their app. But how they are doing that is by increasing your anxiety and feeding you more and more extreme content, which is exactly the way that cults work, right? They show you the least controversial part of whatever they do. They're front-facing organizations. And then little by little, they pull you in more. And by the time you're all the way in, it's like, and you're like, whoa, what's going on? They're like, hey, you knew what you signed up for. You've been here this whole time. But like I like to say to people, it takes 6 months to onboard into both the U.S. Army or the Children of God religious cult. And during that time, you have no idea what you've signed up for. But by the time you do know, you've worked pretty freaking hard to get there. And like, are you likely to just walk away because you don't like the latest revelation or regulation? No, you're not. So anyway, I'm looking at not only physical isolation, right? Like it is no longer just like, oh, if they're on a compound, like if they're not on a compound, they're not isolated, right? We know, look at the Mormons, right? That like you can be completely isolated inside of a closed system while still appearing to function in the world. That is, in fact, the ideal state for cults. because, like Children of God isolated us in these big communes so they could have their very extreme beliefs. But then they had to like force us all into begging on the streets for money, right? But the Mormons just have their people work regular jobs and give them a bunch of their money, but be inside of this closed system. And so the radicalization still happens. Very, very cool book that I listened to this month on my Macmillan Influencer program. So it's coming out soon, is what that means. It's called A Little Less Broken, How a Late in Life Autism Diagnosis Helped Me Feel Whole. Something like that on the subtitle. It's by Marian Shambari. And oh my gosh, I've never felt more seen. She did a pretty different book. Like most of the books on autism and neurodiversity I've seen are like research heavy books. Hers is to autism as mine is to cults. It is her story. It's her life story of growing up as a neurodivergent child, teenager, and young adult, and how like she didn't understand any of it. I also just found out today that sometimes pregnancy is a real trigger for autism and ADHD that has been kept masked to all of a sudden just like come for you and not be maskable anymore. And it makes so much sense to me. I mean, my sensory overload has just been off the charts since I was pregnant. Like, I can't be around perfume, which I always wore before, pretty intense ones. I mean, the clothes that hurt, all of those things. It's also really interesting when she has this moment where, like, she knows that she is. She hasn't had her diagnosis yet, but, like, she knows. And she eventually goes to get her diagnosis. And all of this stuff, by the way, figuring out that you're neurodivergent, I think is a lot like figuring out you're in a cult or being a cult baby who's already left the cult, but then figuring out what it was and then having to need to go through and deconstruct everything in your life. These processes, though, have been very paralleled for me because it was after early readers of Uncultured read Uncultured that they suggested to me that I might be a little spicy myself. Which we've definitely now confirmed. But there's this very interesting part in the book where the doctor has given her this test, these questionnaires that she's supposed to fill out. And of course, she's like questioning if she was supposed to do it this way, if she was supposed to do whatever. And the doctor says to her when she's giving her results process, she says, questioning the questions is part of what helps me make the diagnosis. And then she says, because not a lot of neurotypical people sit around wondering if they're autistic. And that was like for cults. Because this is how I like explain it to people when people are like, oh, is X group a cult? I'm like, if you're asking that, as long as you're asking it in a good faith as a question, like that's part of my assessment because I've never had someone who was in a group that they just loved and everything was good be like, are we a cult? Like, cult, we inherently know, even if we don't know how to explain it, that a cult is a bad thing. And the way that I explain it is all we're saying is that this individual has come under the coercive control of a cult. And I was just doing some quotes from Dr. Janja Lalich this week as I was putting them into the book I'm writing. And she talks about how she, like me, classifies cults has nothing to do with their belief system. All cults give you a transcendent worldview. It's based on your actions. Your actions are what make you a cult. So just be like really clear about that. Anyways, this book is great. Many of us cult babies are neurospicy just by definition because of how we were formed. So it's a really wonderful, wonderful book. That is for sure. I was watching Discovery of Witches because, as we know, I love witch and vampire stories, and this one is one of the best. And there's a show for it, and it's pretty well done. But there's this part where the mother vampire, who's been alive for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, says to a couple, like, never sleep on an argument. And it's like very poignant moment, and then she walks away. And I was like, really? After thousands of years of wisdom, that's your best advice? Because I think this piece of advice is kind of culty, just like the don't gossip. And if you haven't seen my Don't Gossip videos, you should definitely try to find those. But cults are always, and coercive groups and leaders are always trying to control and or denigrate gossip. And in fact, gossip is one of the things that gives humans the edge over other creatures, is our ability to talk behind people's backs. It's also one of the networks most used by women and children, and controlling people talking to each other benefits top down, right? And I just like this never sleep on an argument always comes out of these same cults and from these same types of leaders. And I just find it to be bad advice so often, especially if you're neurodivergent, but so often, like, you just need to diffuse the situation and it won't even be an issue the next day. And I just think this concept of like never sleep on an argument, like, has to do with patriarchy, has to do with like shaming women that they're not allowed to go to bed angry because somebody was being something worthy of being angry about. And, oh yeah, you should probably put out as well, you know, making up. I don't like it. Okay. I also think the story Discovery of Witches could be seen as like the demons are ADHD, the witches are autistic, and the vampires are, I think, dyslexic. But yeah, I mean, people who are autistic usually think they're slightly witchy before they find out, oh, that was all my autism brain. Yeah. Okay, we talked about which military branch is the most culty this week, and I don't even have to stop because right in the back, my husband in the video is like, Marines, and literally every single Marine who sees those videos is like, yep, absolutely. Marines require a lot more dedication of everything and letting the Marines take over everything in your life than a lot of the other branches do. And there's two interesting things that I'll give you. One is all of the branches capitalize their like soldiers, Marine, airmen, sailor in military writing. But only the Marines went and made that an official part of the English language, that Marine is capitalized. And why does that matter? Because it's deification of the soldier, or of the Marine in this case. Because the only other jobs or careers or things that you can do that we capitalize are Savior and Messiah on down. Messiah might actually be more of a name than a job, but Savior, Christian Savior only, of course. So the capitalization of soldier and Marine and sailor, it's a direct allusion to soldiers and Jesus. And I just always like to point that out. Along with like, if you're celebrating your leader's birthday, probably going to be a cult, and all the branches mark their birthday and celebrate them in some way. But Marines usually celebrate the Marine birthday in their homes with their kids eating cake. Like, whoo, it's culty. And finally, there's no such thing as an ex-Marine. If you ask someone if they're an ex-Marine, that is usually what you will be told. They will just retort that like the thought-stopping cliche that it is. And not having a path for people to be ex-members, they're always still members, Mormons and all of these other organizations that don't like to let you leave, just showing that also they don't really respect consent at all. But yeah, it's kind of culty. But also the Army just renamed its program that transitioned soldiers out of the military to Soldier for Life, not just. I got out 2015 and it was called that then. But yeah, little culty, that's for sure. We talked a bit about stereotypes this week, and just like how only looking at cults as the most extreme stereotypes, the Jonestowns, the Wacos, the Children of God, like, that is very unhelpful in helping us actually be able to spot the real cults in everyday life. In the 90s, Margaret Singer and Janja Lalich did a count, and they were at estimating between 3,000 and 5,000, but many, many more that will never be identified, especially when we count single family cults and one-one cult relationships, right? So it's much more helpful, I think, to kind of look at this spectrum. And this was also in Marian's book about autism, where she says, we've been using the term spectrum wrong. because we use it when we are trying to say range, right? You're not more autistic or less autistic. You are autistic, and you have different amounts of masking, different amounts of other conditions that present with it. So, and I feel like this for cults, like once you are a cult, like on my thing, like you're culty, but once you are a cult, like you're just extreme. And it's not like there's a range of less extreme and more extreme. I don't think so. And then I've been talking about my mom. People have had a lot of questions this week about me and my life and growing up in the cult. And one of the questions was, what was it like to grow up with a mom that was only 15 years older than you? And the strange and quite sad answer is, I don't know, because she didn't raise me, because we lived in communes with 100 to 200 people. And I grew up sleeping in dorms and only seeing my mother, who worked as a secretary somewhere else, for 1 hour a day. And then we would get to spend Saturday nights parent night with them and Sundays parent days with them before going back to our cults. And so I was raised by a conglomeration of women and teen girls, some of whom were my mom's age, but my mom had a different ministry. And then when I was about 10 years old, we were in a smaller commune, and she was our teacher, and I got to spend a lot of time for her for a year. And then when I was 11, I was put into the kitchen just to be like the daily kitchen slave and run kitchens to feed large amounts of people. And that was what I did till I was 16, and I left the cult, and I did most of my school in my free time. And so I still didn't really see my mom that much, even though I definitely saw her more every day. So yeah, I have no kind of notion. I mean, I loved the show Gilmore Girls so much when I got out of the cult, because that was like, oh, in another world, like this could have been us, which of course is, I know all the problems now. It's a very romanticized version and white and all of that. But I did not have that experience. Like, I was raised by a community of people. It's also one of the reasons I know how to do so many things. People ask me that. They're like, how do you know how to do so many things? I'm like, well, how many things did you learn to do from your mom? And then, okay, I had like 50 moms. So like, yeah, I can make balloon animals and cook Ethiopian food and so make clothes and, you know, do all these different crafts, and have very few practical skills, but lots of random skills. Anyway, you can again read all about that in Uncultured. Got some books this week that are very exciting because I got Let My Children Go, which is Ted Patrick's book. So Ted Patrick was a man who worked for Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California. He's a black man. He called himself Black Lightning. And first, they tried to recruit his 14-year-old son into the Children of God. And Ted Patrick got him out. And Ted Patrick almost got himself recruited in when he was going there to learn about it, to help get other people's children out, because cult tactics work. Anyways, Ted Patrick then ran a deprogramming program called Free COG, Free Children of God, and he would snatch people, either him and his colleagues or their friends and family and parents would snatch them, and then they would hire him to come in and deprogram. So when we say there's no way to get someone out of cults, we lie, I guess. There's one way, but it's not legal. And he went to jail for kidnapping, unlawful kidnapping, quite a few times. Anyways, I love Ted Patrick because at least someone tried to come for us. And there's also a really funny drunk history narrative about him, which is great. Tia Leving's A Well-Trained Wife came out this month. She came out, or last month actually, came out right on debuted on the New York Times. So good. She's actually coming to our Cult Book Club this month on September 18th at 8:30 p.m. from 8:30 to 10 p.m. EST. And I am selling individual tickets for that. So check out the link in the description if you are interested in hearing this amazing author talk about her work. This is A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from the Christian Patriarchy. Think Shiny Happy People. She's actually one of the people in that show. I'm just starting Lovely One by Ketanji Brown Jackson, who I got to see speak at the Kennedy Center this week. That was very exciting. And I also met up with someone who I've been in contact with, has been in some of my programs, and hopefully she'll write the next amazing book about yoga cults. So that was a really fun thing, and I feel like I'm probably just reading memoirs by Black people for the rest of this year, because I'm just in the middle of like Kamala Harris, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Ted Patrick. I need to reread Willow Weep for Me about Black women and depression by my friend Nana Amadankwa, who's an amazing writer. So yeah, I think this is just I'm just gonna stick with that theme for the rest of the year. I gave up reading books by straight white men when I was doing organizational psychology, because guess who writes all those books? And so much hasn't really fazed me. I feel like we know that perspective already. So that is interesting. Which brings me to the end of my cult sit rep, except for the cult of MAGA. So yeah. I lied. Not just the cult of MAGA. First, there's CrossFit. And is CrossFit culty? I mean, yes. And I think we all know that. And people joke about that. And when organizations are joking about being cults, it's never fun because they're never just good cults. And what do you mean? Oh, yeah, someone died at the CrossFit Games. And there were foreseeable issues. And there was a poor leadership response. And there was individuals being hurt for the good of the group. And the adulation of a few at the top. I feel like CrossFit has always been a bit problematic, and military bros were definitely the skinny white women of that cult. So my theory is skinny white women's kind of like your white feminism who's upholding patriarchy. In these white American cults, we usually see a skinny white woman who's the Allison Mack to the Keith Raniere, right? The Ghislaine Maxwell to your Jeffrey Epstein. The purity that the white woman confers because of white supremacy stereotypes makes someone like me exactly the person you want next to you when you are sex trafficking children. And if you wonder if I've thought about this for myself, yes, I have. I think I played that role in many ways in the military, right? How can the Army be toxic for women if fancy, shiny, and even blonde Captain Daniela Mestenek is doing so well here in the games they usually only let the boys play? Yeah. So anyways, there was a death. There was all of these issues. I think the food control and the appearance control in CrossFit has always been something that is concerning. And back to the skinny white women. There's two other like tropes that we see used in this way to like justify, validate, or whitewash the sins of the cult leader. Which is military officers, plus if they are skinny white women themselves, like we saw in the orgasm cult. And celebrities like Jeremy Spencer or Fleetwood Mac in Children of God, or Tom Cruise, etc., of Scientology, which has many celebrities. And I think that military bros were the skinny white women of CrossFit. So there's a lot more about that. If you want to check out my more detailed video, come see me on TikTok. I just don't have the energy to go into the whole CrossFit saga right now, but there's definitely been a lot of stuff going on with it. And then Cult of MAGA. So first of all, just people on Fox News crying about how they need to stop calling us a cult on the left. And it's like, but this is a cult. It means everything about it. So I do think MAGA is a cult. I talked about this in The Atlantic last year. I have a whole playlist on my TikTok. I think that right now we're in an interesting point. I think maybe he's just trying to crash and burn everything, because the next best thing for a cult leader, if they can't get a win, is to get a very spectacular loss. I mean, they're just kind of saying the quiet part out loud, right? This is their mad Hail Mary grasp for power. I really, really hope, especially doing things like a January 6th gala. Like, I mean, are you kidding? He's just doing the bad guy thing out loud. But as ever, cult leaders know they're the bad guy. I believe that. I don't think it ever just starts off good and goes awry. I do think the weird campaign is so awesome. And I think that hyperbolic exaggeration is exactly how you get at cult leaders. Which is like, they know they're so much worse than weird. They know they're the bad guys, and it's almost like they want credit for that. They want us to be afraid of them, which I think we are, but calling them weird, it's like it's belittling them, and it works perfectly, right? She's literally laughing at them. This is exactly the recommendations I would give to somebody. And finally will be my reminder, if you enjoyed this, please check out our podcasts with Hey White Women that I mentioned at the beginning. I also have another podcast called Cults and the Culting of America, where we are still going through and breaking down all of these things in immense detail. And soon we're going to start having guests. We're going to have guests like people who survived NXIVM. We're also going to have someone talk about teaching. And we're definitely going to have a whole series on the cult of MAGA. So please check us out. And now for some nitpicking. The only things I've gotten even close to completion this week are another collar that I made. I make these out of thread and put them together with junk jewelry that I buy for that purpose or that people send me. And then somebody commissioned some of my love bomb earrings. So they wanted the pride flag, and they're not totally finished because it's still going to have like a part hanging here. And then I got little posts that are pride flags. So these are going to be super cute. And then I also did them the inside out way because I thought that would be cool. I'm sending her too because reasons. Anyway, I do all of these by commissions. I have my exit cost cuffs, which are to remind us of the price we paid to get our freedom. And these, of course, are called the dissent collars. Thanks for hanging out with me today for the Cult Situation Report. And I hope you will like this channel and subscribe. And I hope I will see you back next week. Have a great day.